Start off with you, Mr. Murray. What do you make of his speech? Do you think it leaves him in a stronger position or increasingly vulnerable?
Well, neither. I mean, it's simply evaded all of the important questions. Mr. Assange is wanted by the Swedish authorities to answer claims of a serious sexual case in Sweden. Yet Sweden didn't come up at all in Mr. Assange's strange balcony speech. I think it didn't address any of the important questions in this. And I think one other thing has to be remembered from the outset. Mr. Assange talked about the importance of Barack Obama and America not, as he said, witch-hunting WikiLeaks. This is, again, a great red herring. There is not a witch hunt of WikiLeaks. An organization illegally obtained, or stole as we used to call it, a whole set of government documents and published them with consequences which are still not fully understood and aren't going to roll out for some time to come. Assange didn't mention that. He pretended it was quite something else, as if the American authorities were in a hunt for a phantasmical witch figure. And that isn't the case. There are serious charges against Mr. Assange in Sweden, which he should answer. And the whole issue of his obtaining of documents illegally is another question. But as ever, he has managed to try to blur these and avoid all of the important points.
Mr. Murray, as Qureshi was saying, there's going to take some sort of divine intervention to get him out of the embassy. I mean, he must be going slightly bonkers, staying in that embassy. It's a tiny room. There's no natural daylight. He's got to switch on a little lamp. He's got to walk down the corridor to get water. Do you think that eventually this isolation and possibly paranoia will drive him to leave the embassy?
No, I think Mr. Assange has been bonkers and paranoid for years. It's part of his alleged political makeup, and indeed I would allege that of many of his supporters. This is not about freedom of speech. There's a terrible elision that Mr. Assange and his supporters have been trying to make all along, which is that it should be made, first of all, perfectly legal to steal and publish government documents from the United States or anywhere else. So that's the first thing that they've decided. And the second thing is that they can preemptively decide that the two women in Sweden who've made serious allegations of sexual assault against Mr. Assange are not in any way serious and are somehow put up to it. This is the product of a fevered conspiracy mindset from the beginning. A mindset which is almost messianic in its delusional belief that it can override every single norm of international law, every single norm of criminal law and of national law, and then find itself, and in Mr. Assange's case, in his place of last resort, praising, and I mean it requires a heart of stone not to laugh at this moment, praising the Ecuadorian government for its stand on freedom of speech. I mean, Human Rights Watch found that in 2 weeks of this month alone, the Ecuadorian authorities shut down 6 radio stations and 2 television stations, which they didn't approve of. Ecuador is not a mecca of freedom of speech. It isn't the world capital of decency. It's the last seedy bolt hole to which Mr. Assange thinks he can run, instead of facing, as I say, the very serious allegations which he should face, whether he is whether he thinks himself innocent or not, in Sweden. And it is an absolute disgrace that this discussion about Mr. Assange and his status can continually be pretended to be not about sexual assault claims or the stealing of secret documents and the publishing of them with untold consequences, but something to do with freedom of speech. I mean, even if the Ecuadorian government weren't alongside Mr. Assange on this, it really is enough to make a cat laugh.
There seems to be yet another mixed message which I'd like to put to Mr. Timmins. Assange is also calling for the release of the Russian punk band Pussy Riot. I mean, this comes from a man who worked for Russia Today. Russia Today's boss is Putin. His government is behind putting those girls behind bars. What do you think he was driving at there?
Exactly.
Well, I think that the most shocking thing has been the UK's threat to storm the Ecuadorian embassy.
No, I'm asking you about what
that's
Assange was trying to get
sovereign
across.
territory.
I was asking you what he's trying to get across.
I know that,
you put your point across about storming the embassy. So let's move on to other points, if you don't mind.
Well, not really, because we have to address what was actually just said. But the broadest, most shocking abuse of law has been the threat of the storming of the Ecuadorian embassy. I have spoken to hundreds of Ecuadorians over the last few weeks, and the word they use is disgusting. The word they use is disgusting.
Well,
Ecuadorians. It didn't happen because hundreds of people came out to vigil for it. Hundreds of British people.
It didn't happen because it didn't happen.
We're not talking about something that didn't happen, so if we could move on from that point.
It didn't happen because we're vigilant.
It didn't happen.
Mr. Timmins, maybe you could explain. Mr. Timmins, maybe you could explain this. I'm hearing about these documents.
Shall we move on to right now?
From the Australian government. Maybe you can answer this, Mr. Timmins, since you know the subject so well. Documents from the Australian government are raising, once again, these questions about what Assange's message is. Apparently, one showed that Australian officials had tried to contact Assange 8 times at the Ecuadorian embassy. He refused their help. What do you think is behind that? Could they help him?
I think if you consider help like one random text message, I think a lot of the Northern Hemisphere embassies, and I would include Australia historically as that, but no, he's received no help, and he's been unable to receive help from his own embassy, and I think it's really disgraceful. It's not the only embassy that's got a really bad record, but Ecuador has been fabulous. There's a police station that has been ad hoc set up right next to the Ecuadorian embassy, and I can tell you that it's been a very threatening presence. And I think that's the thing that most people find shocking. They find it shocking that the UK thinks that it can invade a sovereign embassy like Ecuador.
Could I just clear this up?
Sorry,
could I just clear this up again? Because what Mr. Assange's supporter is showing, as Mr. Assange's supporters have pretty much all along, that you can get almost anywhere in this story if you make up your own facts. There is no evidence that the British police sought to storm the Ecuadorian embassy the other night. It is not something that the British police make any kind of a habit of. The British government has said that there was no such thing happening. And again, we see, instead of talking about Ecuador or about Mr. Assange, again his supporter turns it on to the British government, as if it is Britain that is the country that is sort of stampeding over all rights. So
you're the one who's trying to turn it around.
With respect, I'm not making up facts as I go along. The British police, if they think they ought to have, a presence near the Ecuadorian embassy, and I think they should, first of all, because there are large crowds of supporters of Mr. Assange's meeting up, and secondly, because if Mr. Assange does finally come out of the embassy, the British police will and should arrest him for, among other things, skipping his bail. Now, that isn't an unwise thing to do. It isn't unwise to have police in that position. What is not true, however, is that the British police sought to or attempted to storm the Ecuadorian embassy. This is, as I say, from Mr. Assange down to all of his supporters, simply another attempt to make up facts as they go along and persuade everybody else that the la-la land they inhabit is the real world.
Can I just jump in here very quickly?
I've been through all of the court.
Who do you think is ultimately benefiting from all of this?
Oh, who benefits from all this? Well, nobody benefits from it. The Swedish authorities don't benefit from it. The women who made serious allegations against Mr. Assange in Sweden certainly don't benefit from it. I suppose it could be argued that Mr. Assange benefits from it in some way, in boosting his personal profile and, of course, continuing to extend his own personal fight to avoid any kind of answering to his accusers by turning it continuously into an issue about something or someone else. And
okay,
we see a
Mr. Murray, we're going to have to leave it there because it's the end of the program.
This is solely about Mr. Assange going to face justice.
Walking out. So thank you, all three of you, so much for joining us for this rather passionate debate.